Almost every time I talk to someone who has gone abroad, they can't help but rave about how much easier it was to travel by train and how much they enjoyed it. As James Howard Kunstler once said, "The U.S. has a rail system that Bulgarians would be ashamed of." Other than the 17% of the U.S. population that live in what's referred to as the Northeast Corridor from Boston to Washington, D.C., the other 83% of us have hardly any passenger rail service whatsoever. Where it does exist, trains are few and far between. They can come at ridiculous hours, and their lack of punctuality has become a punchline. In the United States, we've been sold on the idea that this is just the American way. We are a car culture, forever wedded to asphalt, highways, and car payments. Freedom is the open road, and our national mood is defined by the price of gas. But considering that driving can be miserable, dangerous, time-consuming, and isolating, is this really a happy marriage? And what about the 30% of people who don't drive or can't drive? How do they get around? Are they somehow un-American? What about trains? Are they also un-American? No, because trains made America. Are they a thing of the past? Well, if they are, then why do we love riding other people's trains so much? What is going on here? I'm Bill Moyer, and this is Reconnect America, a podcast about how rail transport and the corridors that trains operate on offer potential solutions to some of the most vexing problems of our time.
Every small town, every community had a station. Trains were simply the way people traveled.
The post-war period was just complete breakdown of transportation policy.
The interstate highway system was draining freight traffic from the railroads at government expense.
The railroads continue to be strenuously regulated under the presumption that they have this monopoly power that they actually increasingly don't have.
People were looking for endless progress, and they saw that as being cars.
The tracks were in such garbage condition.
Amtrak was actually not formed to rescue passenger rail. It was formed to rescue railroad corporations.
They weren't able to achieve both maintaining service and profitability, and their charter said profitability, so they had to cut service.
There has been a palpable sense of loss.
This is where we have to decide as a society if we want rail service. In my mind, that's deciding to have a future.
Over the next few episodes, we'll delve into the past, present, and future prospects for passenger rail. But I want to note something important here. Before 1970, there was no such thing as a passenger railroad and a freight railroad. There were just railroads. We're going to interrogate that and other common assumptions about the role of rail in our society, and explore the ways in which it might bridge geographic and political divides. We'll hear from folks about the rail system we used to have, what happened to it, and where we can go from here. One of those people is Meredith Richards. Meredith is the chair of the board for the Rail Passengers Association, our country's largest rail passenger advocacy organization. She's also president of the Virginia Rail Policy Institute. In the world of passenger rail, Meredith is a rock star.
I am called the train lady around here. Sometimes they call the Lynchburg Northeast Regional, which is now the Roanoke Northeast Regional, which is a train that I really helped get started. Sometimes people call it Richards Express, but that's just completely a meme, you know.
That's awesome. That's quite a recognition of the impact that you've had.
Well, thank you.
Meredith wasn't always the train lady. She actually holds a PhD in psychology and psycholinguistics. When she first started learning about passenger rail, Meredith was serving on the City Council of Charlottesville, Virginia, a post she held from 1996 through 2004.
I was in local government here in Charlottesville, Virginia. And our economy was kind of a small town economy at the time. And a lot of people were underemployed and were traveling to Washington, D.C., which is 112 miles away on a two-lane US 29. for work. So many times I had people come up to me and say, why can't I take a train? What is it that keeps us from having good passenger service? I started looking into it, and I learned that as recently as the mid-1950s, Charlottesville had 22 daily rail connections to Washington, D.C. And by the time I started looking into this, which was post-Amtrak, which Amtrak was formed in 1971, we had exactly one daily train connecting us to Washington and the Northeast Corridor. And then we had the Cardinal, which connected us to Chicago, but that only came 3 days a week. It was just such a degradation of what we once had. And I would hear from old-timers in the community,
people who are still around and remember the days when they had 22 daily
trains to Washington and other places, small towns along the way, and how they would think nothing of taking a train on a Sunday afternoon to go see a ball game in Manassas, which is in Northern Virginia, or go to have a picnic with the families and just get on the train to do that. They would think nothing of it. It was the way that people connected with each other when they did not just live in the same neighborhood or the same town. They would connect with family and friends and jobs using the trains.
The importance of trains in everyday life wasn't just about frequency of service. It was also a matter of where they went.
We have 21 Amtrak stations in Virginia now. A lot of them are in Northern Virginia, but we had 3 times that. Every small town, every community had a station. So you could literally get anywhere. And some people would go to school daily in Orange, Virginia, and live in Charlottesville or Albemarle County. They would get on the train in the morning and come home from school in the afternoons.
The trains didn't just provide daily commutes and visits to neighboring towns.
People would take trains to get on vacations. All the national parks had connecting trains. I'm sure you've seen those beautiful posters from the 1900s to the 1940s of the parks. The national parks all had gorgeous posters showing mountains and waterfalls and a train. Trains were simply the way people traveled.
Today, this seems like a fairy tale, but it isn't. This was real. So what happened? How did this glorious system go the way of the dinosaurs? It wasn't an asteroid, but it was an astronomical wave of public investment in other forms of transportation that competed with railroads. While the railroads had to build and maintain their own infrastructure, their emerging competition benefited by operating on public roads, waterways, and through airports. Despite not being directly funded by the public, the railroads had been created in partnership with the public. So, they had a unique and legally binding duty to serve the public. This duty is known as a common carrier obligation.
Common carriage is just a different word for no discrimination.
That's Phil Longman, senior editor at the Washington Monthly. He's also the policy director at the Open Markets Institute. I highly recommend you check out his article, Train Train. We'll put a link in the show notes. As Phil describes, the designation of something as a common carrier and the obligations that come with that has a long history.
The concept goes way back, at least to the Middle Ages. Some people can find it in the Code of Hammurabi. But it's basically the idea that when it comes to an essential infrastructure, like a ferry or a stagecoach or an inn, we don't want the owner of that inn to be able to discriminate against different people. Because then who wins and who loses in society is not determined by who's got the best mousetrap, who works the hardest, even who has the most luck. It's like who's got an in with the innkeeper, or who can strike a deal with the ferryman. And so even pre-capitalist economies, people understood when it comes to essential infrastructure, there can't be discrimination.
The regulation of railroads as common carriers was largely due to the Grange movement, a grassroots mobilization of farmers who took on the monopoly power of the railroads. The protections they fought for became known as Granger laws and were enacted in a number of states. But this state-by-state approach came into conflict with the constitutional duty of the federal government to regulate interstate commerce. So, Congress responded by passing the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. This law established our first regulatory agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC.
They said, all right, well, we're going to create a mechanism for setting prices so they can't engage in price discrimination. Everybody pays the same price per mile. We will charge different amounts for different products, but whatever the price was, everybody paid the same. If you move a ham, it costs this, no matter who you are, where you're going.
Though the ICC was weak at first, a number of laws passed in the progressive era of the 20th century eventually strengthened it. The purpose of the ICC was to protect communities that depended upon railroads, and according to Phil, it succeeded.
This system was in place during the Great American Takeoff, the industrial takeoff that created the world's largest middle class, incredible industrial base that won World War II. This is the regulatory regime under which America became great as an industrial power.
We will return to the importance of common carrier obligations for communities and for the country as a whole in a future episode. For now, the important thing is that the Interstate Commerce Commission tried to balance protecting shippers with keeping the railroads financially stable. They established revenue adequacy standards, and those were factored in when they regulated railroad rates. That equilibrium was fragile and not perfectly maintained. But for the first 30 years of the ICC regulation, the railroad industry continued to grow just as it had grown before 1887. The reason was simple.
At the time, up until the 20s, rail transportation was the best technology there was.
That's Tom White. He's been working in the railroad industry for 60 years.
The roads were bad. Everybody knew the roads were bad.
Even as rail became more broadly available in most towns, there were people in more remote areas that couldn't easily get their goods or themselves to the train. A national movement formed demanding better roads, the Good Roads Movement.
People were really interested in not roads to take you on a cross-country road trip, but roads to get you from the rural areas, meaning no other transportation, to the bigger towns that had a railroad to get you to the outside world and basically perform the function of what you would call farm-to-market roads.
However, as automobiles began to offer a viable alternative to rail travel, the demands of the Good Roads Movement evolved.
The movement gained a lot of momentum and had a louder voice. And finally, it reached the Capitol in 1916, where the Federal Aid to Roads Act was passed and created the Bureau of Public Roads. And the mission kind of morphed from farm to market into the vision of nationwide highways right there.
1916 was a pivotal year for railroads as well. It was the year that the U.S. rail network, which had grown continuously for 86 years, first began to contract. One of the reasons for this was the fledgling trucking industry. By the mid-1920s, many truckers had adopted pneumatic tires, allowing them to carry heavier loads over longer distances with greater comfort and stability. In addition, they could reach almost any market in the country thanks to a brand new national highway system paid for by the public. And to top it off, trucking remained almost entirely unregulated until 1935. This meant that truckers could lower rates for shippers at the drop of a hat, while railroads, they would have to wait months for ICC approval. In actuality, it was kind of a free-for-all.
Anybody who could afford a truck could buy a truck and take business from the railroads on the public highways.
So there was no escaping the fact that railroads now had a serious competitor. And the decades that followed would only see the privately owned railroads struggling to keep up with competition that was functionally subsidized because it operated on roads that were paid for by the public. And then came World War II. Yeah, I know It sounds like we just skipped World War I, and you're right, we did. But we're going to get to that in a future episode because it's a pretty interesting story. So anyway, back to World War II.
The last period of highly intensive passenger rail operations in the U.S. was World War II.
The railroads did basically what was completely impossible during World War II. They moved more material in the first few months of the war than they did all through World War I, and all sorts of troop movements.
Passenger trains were carrying soldiers to embarkation points. Trains also carried prisoners of war from the European front. They were carrying citizens across the country at a time when there were severe mileage restrictions to try to save on rubber wheels.
We had rationing of gas and of rubber, and nobody got to buy a car for a long time.
All these kind of wartime provisions put a lot of people on trains.
And obviously, a lot of stuff. It was a brief boom that seemed like a blessing at the time, but such heavy utilization of the trains and the tracks came at a cost.
Equipment was just beat into rubble. The right-of-way was beat into rubble. The War Department determined what improvements were necessary, and they considered virtually everything unnecessary. So there wasn't much that was attractive to passengers at the end of the war. Basically, they had to start attracting business from scratch. So the industry was making a big push right after the war in getting the traffic back.
Although diesel locomotives emerged in the 20s, the technology hadn't fully matured. But during the war, diesel, and specifically diesel-electric engines, proved indispensable in ships and submarines. So all manufacturing was reserved for wartime purposes. This pushed the technology forward while constraining adoption by the railroads.
The War Production Board decided what railroads got to have some. The advantage was obvious in reduced maintenance cost. So, of course, as soon as the war restrictions were over, the railroads started going whole hog into diesel locomotives. There were some railroads that had no steam engines left by the early 1950s. One of the things that did was to reduce the travel time because you didn't have to continually stop for water. They went longer on a tank of fuel than steam locomotives went on a tender full of coal, so they didn't have to stop as often. Steam locomotives quite often only went a couple 100 miles before you had to change engines, whereas a diesel locomotive could go from LA all the way to Chicago, no thing.
On top of investing in new engines, railroads used their wartime profits to resurrect a standard of service that had disappeared during the war.
Well, that's when you got all the new streamlined trains, the comfort, the speed, all came after World War II as an attempt to get the passengers back on the trains. Up until the mid-50s, it was looking good.
But this mini golden age turned out to be a swan song for passenger rail. It was the eye of the storm, a perfect storm that would eventually sweep passengers off of the trains, up into the skies, and out onto the open roads. I feel like I'm talking about Dorothy, the Wizard of Oz. Dun, 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 dun. Back to Phil.
The post-war period was just complete breakdown of transportation policy. The railroads continued to be strenuously regulated as common carriers under the presumption that they have this monopoly power that they actually increasingly don't have.
So while the ICC continued to regulate the railroads as if they were the only game in town, Congress began pouring tens of billions of dollars into other modes of transportation. On June 30th, 1956, President Eisenhower signed the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act, another highway system. But this one was built for a booming post-war population and economy. These roads had twice as many lanes as the original highway system and no intersections. It was a true freeway. Meredith Richards?
That was a time when people thought that there was no end to the progress and the benefits that would come to us from passing on to the next era in transportation. And they saw that as being cars because the high-powered, high-performing cars were coming out, the Fords and the Buicks, and fuel cost 25 cents a gallon, and it was see the USA in your Chevrolet.
With the construction of the interstate freeways, America tied the knot with the automobile.
I hear a lot about how Americans are married to their cars. And a good friend of mine had a good response to that. He says, well, if we're truly married to our cars, it was a shotgun wedding.
This is Stu Nicholson. He is also a member of the board of directors of the Rail Passengers Association.
As drivers, we've all adopted the model that was set up in all of the car commercials, the freedom of the open road. Out there driving in the middle of the desert with nobody else out on the road, the convertible top down, your hair blowing in the wind. It's a total falsehood. You want to talk about misinformation. The auto companies were masters at it. They set up this ideal. Riding down the road in your Belchfire 88 is a life experience. Or in more modern terms, you get the guy that's driving his car around in the heart of a downtown, making power moves around corners like he's driving in a big skid pan, and there's nobody there in downtown. There's no other cars. There's no pedestrians or bicyclists. It's this surreal kind of downtown where if it was done in actuality and not using AI, they had to close down probably a dozen streets to make sure that this guy didn't run into anything big and hard and wreck the car.
The interstate freeways drew passengers out of trains and into cars as fast as they were built. However, this honeymoon would quickly turn to monotony. Due to the phenomenon called induced demand, roads tend to clog soon after construction. We'll return to this idea in a future episode. But unfortunately for railroads, it wasn't just the interstates that were sucking people out of trains.
And then you pour massive, massive subsidies into airline travel.
That's Phil Longman again.
First of all, the development of civil aviation through the military, and then the literal use of public funds to build airports and other air infrastructure. Here in Washington, we have Union Station, which was built in the early 20th century by a bunch of privately owned railroads, and they built at their own expense and operated at their own expense. Coming into the 1960s, the railroads are losing unbelievable amounts of money on every passenger they haul and paying to keep up that Union Station. And meanwhile, the federal government is busy across the Potomac building a brand new national airport for free. Anybody can come and, use the airport, right?
Despite the steady loss of rail passengers in the 1950s and 60s, the government did continue to provide one essential source of revenue to the railroads.
Passenger trains carried a lot of mail and express.
In 1930, for instance, more than 10,000 passenger trains moved mail. This service continued to effectively subsidize passenger service, even as passengers switched over to driving and flying, until the summer of love.
The culmination of the effect of the interstate highway system was the post office removed mail from trains in 1967.
The shift of mail off of passenger trains dealt an enormous blow to railroads.
That revenue was significant to keeping a lot of passenger trains on the tracks. When the railroads lost that contract, that was the killer.
So things quickly started going downhill for passenger rail. And the Interstate Commerce Commission was allowing the railroads to abandon some passenger service.
Between 67 and 71, they started getting permission to abandon trains, and you started losing passenger trains.
Things were getting dire. At the same time that passenger rail was in decline, railroads were also struggling to hold on to their freight business.
Following World War II, the large carriers in the country were ailing.
That's David Alf, an English professor at SUNY Buffalo and author of the new book, The Northeast Corridor, The Trains, the People, the History, the Region. You can find a discount code for his book in the show notes.
And so they pursued mergers to gain some efficiency and size and hopefully survive. One was the Erie-Lackawanna. Another was the Penn Central, a merger of the Pennsylvania Railroad, once the largest corporation in the world, and its former rival, the New York Central.
The merger of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central to form the Penn Central happened in 1968, and it quickly became clear that even that would not be enough. By June 1970, less than 2.5 years after the merger, the Penn Central went bankrupt.
When the Penn Central collapsed into bankruptcy in 1970, it was the largest bankruptcy in the history of the United States until Enron. And this was such a staggering event that legislators knew they would need to intervene to maintain any form of functional freight service or passenger service. Their response was 1971, creating the National Rail Passenger Corporation,
also known as Amtrak.
Less talked about is the 1976 federal creation of the Consolidated Rail Corporation, or Conrail, something like an Amtrak of freight.
Hold on, Dave. We're going to get to that later. For now, let's stick with Amtrak. In order to help these corporations survive, the federal government bailed them out. It created Amtrak to relieve the railroads of their common carrier obligation to move people. Decades of subsidies to automobile and air travel had driven rail transport into the ground. And now, finally, the government was stepping in to protect this vital service. But instead of going all in and subsidizing it as a public good, guaranteeing that every community would be served and launching a rail renaissance, we got something completely different.
Amtrak was actually not formed to rescue passenger rail. It was formed to rescue railroad corporations. And the whole idea was that it would just die a natural death in a decade or so.
They weren't able to achieve both maintaining service and profitability, and their charter said profitability, so they had to cut service.
In Columbus's case, to go from 60 to 70 trains a day to 0. And that's just between the 1940s and 1979. That's barely 30 years.
There has been a palpable sense of loss.
Clearly, this is not the end of the story. We've just brought you to an important crossroads. In 1971, our society's original deal with the railroads was renegotiated. Though some thought Amtrak would just wither away, it did not and would not. And in fact, for the first time in its history, Amtrak has resources for expanding its network. Does it have problems? Yeah, it has problems. Does it face challenges? Most certainly. Will state and regional leadership be important? Of course it will. It'll be essential. But Americans want to ride trains. Communities want to be reconnected. And there's growing bipartisan support and collaboration to make that happen. And that's what we'll be covering in Part 2. Reconnect America is a podcast by Solutionary Rail. This episode was written by Sasha Alenko and me, Bill Moyer. Audio engineering and production by August Moore. Occasional percussion by yours truly, and background music by my old bandmates in Oda Proda. Special thanks to Ken Jacobson for our theme music. You can find this show on Substack, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You may have noticed that this podcast doesn't have ads or paywall. With your help, we can keep it that way. Pitch in and get involved by visiting solutionaryrail.org. We're not here to sell you anything. We are here to build a movement.